Hi, my name is Boris Magocsi, and I work in the Cloud Platform team here at SAP. I work out of the Hamburg, Germany offices, and I'm part of a small team that is dedicated to the task of moving customers or helping customers move from Neo to Cloud Foundry. And that is also the topic of today's talk. I'll be taking you through, what we discuss with our customers, what interactions we've had with our customers around moving from Neo to multi-cloud. So first off, I'll talk a little bit about the motivation for migrating, cover the multi-cloud strategy and its benefits. I don't want to go into too much detail there. Obviously, that's not the core motivation of the session, and there are other sessions for that. And I'll talk a little bit about the approach that we take, what it means to migrate, take you through the phases of our planning and execution of the migrations. I'll show you some example landscapes and talk a little bit about, introduce the concept of a migration pack, and talk a little bit about what it means to what's in a migration pack and what it is for you. And then I have some information about road mapping that we can provide for you, or that we can help you with, that will help answer the question when to migrate. All right, so let's start by looking at the motivation for migrating to multi-cloud. In other words, why do customers want to migrate? What are the benefits of going to multi-cloud? I don't want to spend too much time here because there are more encompassing sessions on this topic. And I have those later on the slides, some introductory sessions to the multi-cloud strategy. But I do want to highlight just a few points that are important in the context of migration and that help kind of set the stage for the discussion around migration. As you're probably aware, or maybe you're not, the Neo runtime is hosted by SAP and SAP's own data centers. And the main difference here when moving to multi-cloud, or when you move over to multi-cloud, is that you then have the benefit of operating on the hyperscaler providers that are shown here on the screen. And that just provides our customers with so much more flexibility. And most customers, at least in their strategy or in their implementation, already are working together with hyperscaler providers. And it just makes so much more sense than to also provide SAP functionality on those hyperscalers. So for instance, if an S4 system maybe is already hosted in the cloud, it makes a lot of sense to then also host the cloud platform functionality that we're talking about here today, co-locate that in the cloud on the same hyperscaler provider to provide a physical closeness to the S4 system, and to also allow the customer to benefit from the infrastructure as a service provider's feature set, which are highly focused on high availability, on flexibility, and that are, to be honest, not part of SAP's core competency, right? So the idea is that SAP wants to focus on integration with SAP software, extensibility of SAP software using the cloud platform, and not really on the infrastructure. It's never been our core business. And by allowing customers to operate on multi-cloud environments that they prefer, the customers can also reap those benefits. Okay, so I think I mentioned some of the benefits of multi-cloud. But let me give you an example of one of the projects that I'm currently working on together with our customer that has chosen to migrate from Neo to Cloud Foundry. And I guess this is a good point for me to emphasize, that the customer really is in complete control and in charge of the time frame of this migration and the steps, when to execute what steps. So this is something that we're obviously not forcing customers to do. We provide this information and the roadmap information so that the customer can make informed decisions about when to migrate and what to migrate when over to multi-cloud. And the example that I want to give you is I have a customer that would like increased resilience or reliability of the API management layer that they have in front of their their production implementation. So this is the API management service in Neo that I'm talking about. And what they would like to do is increase the reliability of that service and make use of the multiple availability zones that are available on the hyperscalers, right? So by moving just that one layer over and leaving the rest in Neo for now, the customer is able to make use of the benefits of multi-cloud in advance of migrating the rest of their components over. And I'm sort of giving a preview of how the migration projects are executed already, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. Beyond this, what I just gave as an example, maybe just a few other things that a lot of our customers are interested in when they're looking at multi-cloud. The data center coverage is much larger than just the SAP data centers. So you have regional zones that go beyond what SAP is able to provide. That's really important for most of our customers, and for a few key customers that need to retain their data within specific geographic regions or really legal jurisdictions. So there are reasons for hosting your data, for instance, within the EU or within specific countries. And this multi-cloud approach or the hyperscaler approach allows customers to do that and to benefit from the availability of those data centers across the globe. And that kind of gets to the key point, which is, like I said before, SAP is not in the business of operating infrastructure. So the money that you spend on the multi-cloud providers, that really goes towards the infrastructure itself and improving that infrastructure and making sure that it's resilient and so forth. And that's just not where SAP wants to operate. It's not our core competency. So now in this next section, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to migrate, how to migrate, how we are structuring this topic in customer discussions, and how we help customers structure the projects, the migration projects, and so forth, how we think about migration, and introduce a few key concepts around the actual migration. So just some rough phases, and I'll say a few words to each of these, and I've got a few slides around each of these. The learning phase is where the customer informs, and maybe you've already gone through this and you know you want to migrate and you know where you're migrating. But I want to say at least half of our customers, they haven't really had the experience of executing on executing a project on Cloud Foundry or in multi-cloud. So they need to familiarize themselves with the target environment. That's what that's about. The differences between Neo and Cloud Foundry, for instance. Then it makes sense to go through analysis to decide what gets migrated over. Then you prepare the migration, which is basically like a road mapping service. And finally, there is the execution of the migration projects where you're actually doing the hands-on work of moving components over from Neo to Cloud Foundry. All right, so let's talk about what happens in each of those key steps. And by going through this, I think you'll pick up a little bit on how we structure this topic, like I mentioned, and what the important aspects are for our customers. For some customers, this may not apply, but for a number or enough customers, I've run into enough customers that don't really know Cloud Foundry yet as a target environment. And if you're going to be moving your production landscape over from Neo to Cloud Foundry, it's really important to understand where you're going to. And that sounds kind of, I don't know, banal or obvious, but I want to underscore that it makes sense to gain some experience ahead of a migration project and to understand the target environment, because I have had some customers come into projects like this with the expectation that Cloud Foundry is really just like a newer version of Neo, like a Neo 2.0, and that's just not the case. There were some key changes that were made for very good reasons. And so it is a different environment, and especially around the governance model that is provided by Cloud Foundry. We see some bigger changes there, and customers who are very heavily invested in Neo kind of struggle at first to understand those differences. if they're not presented properly, or if they dive in, get ahead of themselves and try to implement on Cloud Foundry without doing the groundwork, I guess is what I'm saying. I don't want to make too big a deal about this, but the idea is Cloud Foundry is in fact, different than Neo. It makes sense to take a look, to familiarize yourself. It does also make sense to look at each of the services that exist on the Cloud Foundry side. Business Application Studio is a great example of that. It used to be Web IDE on the Neo side, and now on the Cloud Foundry side, we've got Business Application Studio, which is a much more powerful tool. But it means that there is a change there, and that you need to be familiar with that change. And in that case, it's very easy to make that transition, but it's a conscious decision that a customer needs to be aware of. And you need to look at the services and see what changes have occurred in those services. And then one of the best practices that I guess that we recommend to customers is that that they maybe start, before they migrate this, that they start developing new functionality on Cloud Foundry instead of Neo. So if they perhaps have already moved over to CPEA, that makes it really easy to get started on Cloud Foundry. You can just start services as you need and consume them and gain experience and develop on the target side ahead of the actual migration project, right? So now you've got an idea of what the target looks like. The next step would be to perform an analysis and to look at the landscape, the production landscape in Neo, and to look and see what makes sense to move and when to move that. Yeah, and for this is kind of a key concept here. For this reason, I introduced the idea of scenarios, and we talk about migrating scenarios over rather than just applications, because usually customers have more than a single app, and scenarios are like groups of apps that are relevant to one another, that are related to one another, and that should be moved together because they have some kind of a dependency to one another. That could be like a logical dependency. It could be a dependency for the end user. You want your end users to have the same user experience across the set of applications that you rolled out to them. The dependencies could be, for instance, data level dependencies. So you want to make sure that all the apps that depend on the data that you're moving across also get moved across. You want to take a look and see which apps are critical, which apps are less critical. We always recommend to customers that they first move their less critical apps over to Cloud Foundry so that they can gain some experience with the migration process and also with the target environment, and then work their way towards the more critical applications. And as a general best practice, and I should say none of these rules are hard set. There's always exceptions to these rules, but these are basically the questions that we ask when we are in a discussion with customers and we're doing the analysis with customers. For instance, we try to get them to avoid mixing Neo and Cloud Foundry in the target solution. So you really don't want to have one scenario or one app that's reaching across both of those platforms. The idea is to move things over and then to have your investment on either one platform or have it on the other platform. Right? So that's the general guidance that we're giving customers. And now in terms of moving, the way that we look at this is we look at the individual Neo services that are in use, and those are moved on a service by service basis. So we're cutting the landscape, we're looking at scenarios, but when we're talking about the actual doing, we're cutting the landscape up by Neo service, right? So you move the CPI implementation over, you move the HANA service over, mobile services get moved over separately, and for this we have so-called migration packs, and those are service-based migration packs. Right? And I'll talk a little bit about what a migration pack is, but it's important to understand that that is on a service level. So that's why I'm talking about services here at this point, I guess, is the idea. So now once you have basically a prioritized list, an idea of what you want to move over and how to move it over, you can put together a roadmap. So you now have all the information that's required in order to do road mapping. And here is where we are currently in the bulk of our discussions with customers, is helping them to roadmap their migration projects. And as I'm recording this, it's early Q4 in 2020. You're watching this in later Q4, and by then the situation will have changed a little bit because we'll have released all of the software that we need to do the migration. But road mapping currently, as I'm speaking now, is much more important because we don't have all the tooling available to move all the services. So we're helping customers plan that and helping them to understand when they are able to migrate. And by the end of Q4, or by January 1st, really, where we have everything in place, or we will have everything in place. So more or less by the time you're watching this, we'll have everything in place to help customers move in a scalable fashion. So any customer that wants to move in 2021 will be there and supporting with the tooling and the documentation that is required. And with the analytical support, I guess, or consulting support, and the partners in place to perform those moves. Right? So there's a few questions that come up here on the slide. The idea is just that we're looking at each service and how the features map between the Neo service for CPI, for instance, and the Cloud Foundry version. Generally, there's a match there, and in some cases, some features were not implemented on the target side, or they were implemented differently. So it's important to understand those differences. And then there's always a question of what needs to be migrated, what does not need to be migrated, depending on the effort to move things. Sometimes it makes sense to for instance, I've had customers refill their HANA database on the target side rather than try to migrate all of the data across. Yeah, so each project's a little bit different, and these questions come up on a case-by-case basis. I mentioned them a few times now already, and here I'm I guess really introducing the topic of a migration pack for the first time, and it's really the core of the work that we're doing here in the team that I'm in with my colleagues. And we're part of development, and basically a migration pack is the tooling and the documentation that is required to move a service across from Neo to Cloud Foundry. And here on the slide, you can see the help portal documentation around the available migration packs, and this list is growing as we speak. I provide a link here in the bottom right corner to the help documentation, and I'll emphasize that at the end of the presentation one more time, because this is really the central go-to point for everything that I'm talking about today, planning your migration and getting into a discussion with us around migration. All of that is located here in the central document on help.sap.com. Yeah, and there you'll find the information that you'll need to plan your migration, and also the migration packs themselves are provided there. So you can go there and see what's available, what form they take, how they operate, the documentation to them, and so forth. Yeah. One or two really simple landscape examples in Neo that I show my customers when I'm consulting with them. And I put basically these slides together just to kind of illustrate a few points. So in this landscape, we've got 3 applications that are deployed. And you can see that they use a set of services on Neo. Mobile services and CPI and HANA and API management are being used. And this is sort of an artificial example, you might be able to tell, but it's pretty close to what our customers are doing. And it's certainly realistic and possible situation to be in, if it's maybe a little bit simplified. But if this customer were asking me today to how they would, or how they should move, I would tell them that, well, if they wanted to move that first application, number one, they would take the migration pack for mobile services and for cloud integration, and they would use the tooling and the docs available in those 2 migration packs and execute their move for app 1. And if we're talking about, for instance, app 2 and app 3, then I would probably talk to them about maybe moving those together because they have a shared dependency around HANA, right? So it's really kind of a basic concept, nothing really complex going on here. But it illustrates the points around the dependencies and the planning and the migration packs that I introduced. Here's a slightly more complex and more realistic example that my colleagues put together around based on what they're seeing in production landscapes. And it just shows the more typical dependency chain that a customer would have in production. So you've got all kinds of services in use here. You've got the portal, you've got back-end connectivity. This is really fairly realistic. You've got a lot of Java content and you've got UI5 content with dependencies between them. And I guess there's just a couple of points that I want to make here around this complexity. So this is much more, you know, close to what you see in production. So for the customers, for instance, that are using the SAP Cloud SDK, this is a great time to bring this up. You have this Java app number 2 here using the Cloud SDK. Those customers have an easier time moving because that Cloud SDK is kind of a unifying layer between Neo and Cloud Foundry. And you know, you're sitting on top of that SDK, and underneath it's handling the calls to the respective environment. So you're not having to think so much about the changes that need to be made there. I should add that our current plans are, and this is roadmap information, so I don't think I have a clear date yet on when this is being released, but the idea is that Java applications will be redeployable between Neo and Cloud Foundry. Try to avoid as much as possible having to make changes, so customers can just take their applications and redeploy them. Some changes will be necessary in some cases, and in a lot of cases, you know, customers will want to make changes to make use of the architectural changes between Neo and Cloud Foundry. It just makes a lot of sense to change your approach when you're going to a new platform. But the main benefit here is that you know, you don't have to make those changes. You're not forced to do it in the context of the migration project. You can redeploy, and you can re-architect or redesign things later, refactor things later, and and the application can grow when the customer is ready. So we're decoupling this effort from the migration itself. I'll talk a little bit about the road mapping and when to migrate. And because I get a lot of questions around this, you know, obviously customers want to understand what the plans are going forward. And you know, I've been working in this project, in this migration project for quite a while now, and I want to say probably at least 18 months. You know, planning the approach, coming up with the concepts that I've outlined here in these slides, and I think you know, almost the number one question, I guess, is that customers want to understand what timeframes I'm talking about in terms of Neo availability, and are we, you know, does it mean that we're decommissioning Neo, or what exactly why am I talking about migration? What is, you know, it's kind of an open question, or it's the question that's buzzing around in customers' minds, and it's a perfectly valid question. It's very understandable because customers have made, in some cases, very substantial investments in their Neo landscape. And we want to ensure that customers can reap the benefits of those investments, and that they're not forced to you know, make a change by us, and that when they're ready to make the change, and they want to make use of the multi-cloud environment, and they want to make use of the extended and enhanced feature set of each of the individual services that are available on the Cloud Foundry side, that the customer can choose the time frame when this happens, right? And just in terms of, I always like to go back, because I guess an engineer by training, or I have a development background. I always like to talk about numbers, and I have a background in physics as well. So you know, I'm always most comfortable when I've got some cold hard facts to back up my approach and you know, the direction that we're taking, and just in terms of raw numbers, we have so many customers on Neo currently in production with very important investments there. And it just wouldn't physically be possible to move all those customers over in a short time frame of any kind. So we're talking about Neo being available for many years to come. The main motivating factor for customers will be, and this will grow and grow, is that the innovation platform is now already Cloud Foundry, right? So the new features, the interesting stuff is going to be happening on the Cloud Foundry side, and that's what's driving customer interest now. Besides the hyperscale multi-cloud approach that I outlined at the beginning, it's the idea that the innovation is going to be happening there on the Cloud Foundry side. So I hope that at least that point is clear, because I think it's a very important point. We understand and respect the investment that customers have made on Neo, and we want to protect that investment and allow the customer to be in charge of the time frame to move over and to make benefit. So this is very much a pull approach, where customers are in charge and are able to decide. And okay, so we put together just a short list of other TechEd sessions that are related to the topic that I've presented today. And so let's see, I think I had these on the earlier slides too, but they're kind of consolidated here. There's a good session around the multi-cloud platform strategy. There's a roadmap session for Cloud Platform that you should be aware of. There's if you're looking for more technical detail, because I wasn't really able to provide that in this session, because if I start doing that on a service by service basis, then it won't be a 40-minute session. It'll be a 3-hour session, and I can just go on and on about each of those. And that was not the idea. I wanted to kind of lay the groundwork for how we structure this whole topic, and where to find information and who to contact around migration. If you're looking for more technical detail around how, for instance, the integration services, CPI, API management are doing their migration, then there's a session for that, Dev 203. And I also especially want to call out the session around migration to HANA Cloud, because HANA Cloud is the target database of choice in the multi-cloud environment. And that is becoming a very important topic to our customers, and customers who have a large investment in HANA will want to understand that target environment, especially, and what it takes to move across. And let's see, in the links collection that I have here, the last link is the one that I showed in the slide, the documentation, and it's kind of a long link, unfortunately, here on the slide, but we now have a shortened version. So I think it's I don't want to say anything wrong, but I think it's basically the URL at the beginning is the same, helpsap.com/viewer, and then it's SAP or CP migration guide, I think it is. I won't get it right, so I'll skip saying that here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get it into the slide, but we have a nice shortened version. That really, I want to just underline, that really is the main go-to point for information. Everything that I discussed today in the session is available there, the approach that we're taking. And it's also the main channel to contact me and my colleagues around migration. So we have an email address there, and I have it on the last slide. I'll call it out there as well, where you can write us, and we can help you through this discussion and through the steps that I outlined. And we have a little bit of a service offering around the road mapping that you can make use of, so that you can understand what it takes to migrate, what the steps are to migrate, and when it makes sense to migrate. And I invite you to visit the SAP Learning Hub for more information around, especially around the target platform. Like I said, it's important to understand where you're moving to. So I think this is a great resource to build up knowledge in advance of doing any kind of migration activity. Yeah. And then finally, I would like to say thank you for listening. We have our contact information here on this slide. So my name is Boris Magocsi, and I'm part of the migration team here and the Cloud Platform team at SAP. And we have this very nice anonymous mailbox, sap.cp.migration. If that's the best way to contact me and my colleagues, there are a number of us that are looking there, that's how we start the discussion with our customers. And I'm looking forward to any feedback that you'd like to give, any questions that you have around this topic. I really enjoy learning about what our customers are going through and helping our customers move from A to B, and just understanding what customers have built. I think that's really interesting. So please feel free to reach out to us. And thank you for listening today, and thank you for attending today's session.